Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to The Struggle to Know, where we will continue our conversation here in the city of Cleveland. Actually, we're in East Cleveland, and we're going to be talking to some brothers who have a lot to contribute, I think, to this series of conversations. So my name is Tristan, and we'll kind of go around and let everybody introduce themselves.
Yes. Alhamdulillah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Musa with you, alhamdulillah, we're honored today to be spending some time with the Abdul Samad family. We have our dear Sheikh Muhammad Abdul Samad, who became Muslim in his late teens, yes. Alhamdulillah, and then would find a sister who would also embrace Islam, and they would get married and start a family. They have 7 children and 28 grandchildren, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
And we have 3 generations of Islam sitting with us at this table. So Sheikh Muhammad's son, Karim, and his grandson, Asim, Duval, excuse me. Right. So we should have some interesting perspective, as Tristan mentioned. This is the struggle to know. We're here to try to understand race relations within the Muslim community, particularly here in Cleveland, but even beyond Cleveland, because there's going to be overlap, of course. So to be able to get this type of insight, I pray and I hope will be a source of benefit for all of us here and all those who listen. So Sheikh Muhammad, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your experiences being here, born and raised in Cleveland, embracing Islam, and whatever you think might just help us understand a little bit about your journey and how that became, mashallah, a whole generations of Islam, inshallah, till the day of judgment.
Alhamdulillah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I don't know if I can say it all in the time that we have, but I'll try to compress it into as much time as we possibly can. As Sheikh Musa said, my name is Muhammad Abdul Samad. I'm 68 years old. I embraced Islam when I was 17 years old. It's in 1969. A little bit about myself and my family and the climate of the American society when I grew up. But first, let me tell you a little bit about my childhood. I was born and raised a Christian in the Catholic tradition. As a matter of fact, I was very serious about Catholicism as a child, through my parents, through my grandparents. I served as an altar boy. At one point, I can actually remember wanting to be a priest in the Catholic religion because I just admired the humility and the impact that the priesthood had on people and the respect that priests had on the Catholic congregation. I can remember actually holding the plate under people's chins as the priest would pull out a little wafer and they would stick out their tongues and he would say, Astaghfirullah, the body of Christ. And he would put this wafer in their mouth and I would see them swallow it. And I remember every time he said that and I saw them swallowing it, I really believed that that was the body of Christ. And I can remember feeling this nausea that was coming from me every time they said it and they swallowed it hungrily. And I never thought too much about it, but now when I think back, I know where that came from. Moving forward, I went to Catholic school, and at about the age of about 13, I began to have stirrings of the whole Catholic thing. And it dawned upon me one time when I was kneeling after confession and I was praying to the statue of the Virgin Mary, peace be upon her. And I was asking her to speak to God and ask God to forgive me for my sins. And I remember thinking even at a young age then, this is a statue. It doesn't make sense. I kept these feelings inside of me. I never shared them with anyone because I felt that I would get in trouble. We would have to go to catechism class. Every Wednesday. It was mandatory after school. And as I began to have these these sensations of doubt and fear that was boiling inside of me, I made it up in my mind that I was going to ask a question in that catechism class. And so the nun, and any of you who have ever had the experience of being raised in a Catholic school, they ruled with the stick. And I remember how she walked around with this long pointer with the rubber tip on it. And she would be talking and walking with the stick. And she ended the session, I can't remember what she was talking about, but I do remember this. When she asked, does anybody have any questions? I stopped for a second, then I raised my hand. And she's standing up there and she says, well, what do you have? What question do you have? And I lowered my eyes because I knew what this would bring. And she said, speak up. I couldn't even look at her. I looked down at my desk and I said, Sister Patrick Marie, God is all powerful, right? Yes. There's nothing that is equal to him, right? Yes. What's your point? Get to your point. Then why do we need two other gods?
Allahu Akbar.
13 years old.
Allahu Akbar.
I still remember seeing her, you know how they used to wear the long habits with the long veil coming? It was kind of like blowing down the aisle as she's coming towards me.
La ilaha illallah.
I braced myself for the stick because I knew I was going to get whacked. But instead of whacking it, she dropped the stick and she grabbed me by my cheeks and pulled my cheeks to her face and pointed her finger at me. Don't you ever question the Trinity. It is a mystery and you have to believe it. Do you understand? And I said, no. At that point, I became an apostate in Christianity. As a matter of fact, I got to the point where I was almost atheist at that young age, where I didn't even want to believe in God. I used to play a sick game with my kids, not my kids, my sisters and brothers. And I would, our kids play these games when their parents aren't around, and I would say, I bet you in 10 seconds, I'm not gonna die. That's how low I had gotten in my faith. And one time I said that, it struck my heart. And I left the room and I went upstairs to my bedroom and I just felt this fear. I didn't know what it was. I never played that game again.
Sheikh Muhammad, I want to ask you this question because I'm interested to know what type of factor this played in your decision. What was the kind of makeup of the background and the race of the nuns of the school that you went to? Were they predominantly white?
They were all white.
The statue was white?
The statue was white.
Yeah.
Mary was white. Jesus was white. Joseph was white.
Right.
All of the statues that they lined up for the around the church for the Stations of the Cross, all of them were white.
Now, at that time, how did that factor into just your thinking? Or was that something maybe you look back on later?
Yeah, it didn't factor. I just thought that that's just the way things were at that age.
Right.
Okay, but something began to happen between the time that I was 13 and between the time that I was 17 in America. And that was the civil rights. And my parents became actively involved in fighting against racism and hatred from white America. And they began to involve themselves with many organizations for the freedom, and the non-discrimination of African Americans. And I remember when Martin Luther King came to Cleveland, we actually marched with him to the stadium downtown.
Allahu Akbar.
And we sung the songs, and thousands of people marching for freedom and justice. And so that was my springboard into being involved in civil rights in America. Now, me being 14, 15 years old.
So you weren't Muslim yet?
I was not Muslim yet.
Yeah.
I became involved in a little bit more militant aspect of the civil rights movement, shall I say.
A little bit more.
As a matter of fact, I enjoyed the company of many of my friends who had joined the Black Panthers, who had been involved in the Back to Africa movement and the nationalism of black nationalism, black pride. And I began to immerse myself in that culture. And that was when I was about 15, 16 years old. Grew a big afro. You wouldn't believe it now.
I love to see some photos.
Yeah.
Had a
My
nice
father,
afro.
he had hair until he made Hajj, and ever since he got back from Hajj, he hasn't had any hair.
Allahu Akbar.
Allahu Akbar. MashaAllah.
And I began to surround myself with people that were involved in black nationalism and in Black Panthers. I joined it and began involved in that, and my parents started looking at me very strange. And at one point in time, my father and we got involved in some arguments, and I left home because of that.
How old were you at that time?
I was 16 years old. And began to get involved in the black nationalist movement and all that, and being involved in some of the rebellions that were going on in the ghettos of America. And one day I was at a barbershop, getting my fro touched up.
MashaAllah.
And these brothers walked in. They had this presence about them. I didn't know what it was, but I was awestruck. They had a light. And I remember to this day, Sheikh Mutawaf, Abdul Shahid, Brother Yahya Abdul Sabur, and Brother Abdul Rahim Abdullah. And they walked in that barber shop, and I looked at them, and my head froze. And I wanted to soak in every word that they were saying. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I looked at them and I said, I gotta find out who these people are. But they were older at my age. I was afraid to even approach them because they were like, nobody ever seen anything. I mean, people were involved in black nationalism, but I could tell these were not black nationalists. And I used to see them occasionally walking past because one of the brothers stayed on my street, and they would always walk three together.
Sunnah, MashaAllah.
Mutawaf Abdul Shahid, Abdul Rahim Abdullah, and Yahya Abdul Sabur. I'm sure everybody knows these brothers. And one day, I came off my porch and I talked to Mutawaf Abdul Shahid. He had a bald head. I found out now that he had just made Hajj. And I went up to him and I said, Salam, brother. And that was kind of like a ubiquitous term that every black person used to say. Salam, brother. And he said, it's not just salam, it's assalamu alaikum.
MashaAllah.
And I said, huh? He said, we're not black nationalists, we're Muslim. And I thought he was talking about the Nation of Islam. I said, oh, you mean Elijah Muhammad? He said, no, none of that crap. We talking real Islam.
Allahu Akbar.
Wow, mashallah.
He said, you need to rap with us one day. And they walked away. Again, I'm standing there, my jaw just dropped open, watching them walk away.
Wow.
From that point on, you know, we know how the story ends.
Yeah.
Mashallah.
I'm standing here today,
This is like 1970.
it was 1970.
Wow.
So I became Muslim in May of 1970.
Wow, mashallah.
And
Sheikh, there's, because again, I think this is all very fascinating, and I want to
Mhm.
hear your perspective, your son, your grandson. What were your expectations when you went into the deen? Coming from like a black nationalist perspective,
yes.
kind of denouncing what Catholicism and Christianity was about. When you now find this particular lifestyle, what were your expectations going into the deen? How did you experience it in those early days? And how did that kind of like maybe transform or meet up to those expectations as you got older in the deen?
The expectations when I became Muslim was resounding this. La ilaha illallah. That was it. And when I learned what that meant, my heart just filled up. Because I knew that that was something that I was looking for and something that I
didn't
was,
know what it was.
thirsty
Subhanallah.
for.
Right.
Tawheed.
Mhm.
And the Tawheed was just something that I just loved to say over and over. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. And it quenched the thirst in my soul.
Mashallah.
So you can imagine now, I've gone from Catholicism to atheism to mockery of Allah to civil rights to black nationalism to Islam within a span of 3 years.
Mashallah.
Imagine my parents seeing me go through this. They thought
Wow.
I had lost my mind. Especially when I start coming home with a prayer rug and reading some Quran with some Arabic, trying to, say Arabic prayers. But back then we didn't know Arabic. We had transliteration. And so they thought it was better to get me out of Cleveland.
Oh, man. Mashallah.
Wallahi. So I had an aunt in Cincinnati. May Allah bless her. She was an aunt that always took everybody that from the family that kind of needed to get away. And they sent me to Cincinnati. And I took my prayer rug and I got on the Greyhound bus and I went to Cincinnati. And I moved to Cincinnati and began to work at the Call and Post newspaper by, that's a whole nother story, but got a job working at the Call Post newspaper in Cincinnati and was delivering the newspapers, the African American newspaper down there. My aunt's husband was the editor of the Call and Post newspaper. He taught me a lot about journalism and all that. But the most important thing was the street that I moved on. Right next door was a family that had a very nice family that we moved next to. And there were 5 girls and 1 boy. And I took a certain interest in one of the girls next door, and 50 years later, she's my wife.
Allahu
Akbar.
Alhamdulillah.
Mashallah.
Mashallah. Allahu Akbar.
Love of my life.
Allahu Akbar. And this you're about 18 years old at this time now?
Yes, by that time I'm 18 going
You're
on 19.
Muslim and you're in Cincinnati
I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio.
and you meet your future wife to be.
I meet my future wife to be.
Now, when you were there in Cincinnati, you're a Muslim. Did you have any exposure to Muslims out there?
None.
So,
Not at first.
okay.
I was kind of alone. I didn't know that there was no mosque there at the time, but the University of Cincinnati had a MSA, and they had a place on campus where the Muslims would go. But they were mostly immigrant Muslims, okay, and you know, I would visit there sometime and study and read books. But when I met my future wife, it was interesting. I don't want to take up too much time. Am I?
No, not at all.
Okay.
It's fascinating. Yeah.
It was interesting because she knew that I was Muslim. Everybody, who's this big, this guy with this big afro coming from Cleveland, and you know, everybody wanted to know who I was and what I was about. And I don't know how she found out that I was Muslim, but one day she came to me and she said that you're Muslim, right? And I said yes. And she told me about this paper that she's working on. She says, well, I'm working on this paper, this paper for high school. And I said, what's it about? She said, it's the Nation of Islam versus Orthodox Islam. And I'm like, what? And she's standing there. And I'm like, my mind is blown. I come all the way down here, move next door, and you come to me talking about, you got working on a paper about, you know, Orthodox Islam versus the Nation of Islam, and you writing a paper on it? I'm like, what? You know? I said, well, where you learn about Islam? She said, well, I study all kind of religions, but this is, you know, I thought this was something that I wanted to write about, something to that effect.
For any of our young men listeners, if a young woman comes to you and says she's writing a paper about Islam, it's time for you to stand up straight and choose your next words very carefully. If you do like Sheikh Abdul Samad, this might be a happy ending, inshallah.
Yes.
MashaAllah. Alhamdulillah.
So she showed me the paper, and it was a comparison, and it was excellent.
MashaAllah.
The research that she had done on it, pros and versus the cons, was excellent. I was hard tasked to find anything to criticize the paper about. And she was not even Muslim.
Oh,
So that kind of fixed in my head which one of the five young ladies next door I was going to try to talk to.
as one of them unintended mercies
Yes.
where you kind of get kicked out of the house
Yeah,
and forced
yes.
to leave your hometown.
Yes.
And you meet your wife.
Yes.
That's
And
kind of
you-
like Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, you know?
Allahu Akbar.
Allahu Akbar.
All right, no
MashaAllah.
doubt. SubhanAllah.
Alhamdulillah.
So Sheikh Abdul Samad, if I could maybe telescope the conversation a
yes,
little bit.
please.
From our elders, what we hear is that the Islam, like through the 70s and 80s, maybe even into the mid 90s, Cleveland was a very important part of the life of Islam in America.
Absolutely.
And Cleveland, that life was carried predominantly by our African American brothers and sisters.
Correct.
So is there something maybe about that era that you wanted to describe, like if there are kids who just grew up, you know, like whatever, playing video games and
Yeah.
Instagram, Snapchat, and they don't know about that time, but you want them to know, like, what was that like, that existed, and what it was like, and what were the good things about that time? Like, what would you want to share with them?
Yes. 1971 is the time that you're talking about in my life, when Cleveland was one of the major cities of Islam in America, especially for Sunni Muslims and those who are reverting back to Islam, which is the reason why I left Cincinnati, because I wanted to come back to Cleveland to be part of this movement of Islam in Cleveland. Cincinnati was nice, beautiful city. There was no Muslim community there for me. I left Cleveland. I left an Islamic community in Cleveland, okay, sort of against my will, okay, but I migrated back for the express purposes of raising my family. Okay, by that time I had gotten married and decided that it was time to move back to Cleveland because we wanted to raise our children in within the Islamic community.
If I may ask, what was the African American community like in Cincinnati at that time?
Non-existent, to my knowledge.
SubhanAllah, yeah.
It was mostly predominantly Nation of Islam.
And Sheikh, when you say there was already a established Muslim community in Cleveland,
Yes.
what did that Muslim community look like? We're African Americans, right?
99.9% African American.
Subhanallah.
Okay. First Cleveland
Right.
Mosque, and there was Masjid al-Mukmin,
Oh,
okay,
mashallah.
were the predominant true Muslim communities in Cleveland. And as we know, the first Cleveland Mosque is the second oldest mosque in the United States.
Right.
It's been here since 1936.
And when I spoke to Imam Abbas, he says arguably it could be the first. It
Yes.
just depends on like when you officially counted in the paper.
Exactly.
But yeah,
Exactly.
36, 37, right?
Yeah, it's about a year apart. The oldest one is in Iowa, I believe. Wow. And then you had...
I know. I would love to know the story behind that.
know that, yes. But yeah, the first Cleveland Mosque were older brothers. When I say older, when I was young, older meant 40 years old.
30s and 40s.
Now that I'm 68, it ain't older no more. But they were older brothers. The brothers were 40, 50 years old. Masjid Mukmin was a masjid that was changing from an elder African American leadership to a very young, vibrant, energetic leadership, which was led by Sheikh Mutawaf Abdul Shahid. And he was young, vibrant, and he was a vanguard in the Islamic community and still is for many years. One of the first mentors of my life in Islam. He gave me my shahada.
Mashallah.
Mashallah.
I want to come back to that, inshallah,
Mm-hmm.
especially of how the community kind of developed and evolved with the passing of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I also want to get some perspective from your son Karim,
If
your
I-
grandson. Yes.
One other point. So when we came back to Cleveland, we were the only people that were recognizably true Muslims. Okay. Not only by our voice, but we adapted the dress of the Sunnah. Our sisters wore hijab. Okay. Okay. Unapologetically, they wore it. And they were out front with us establishing, and people would, what is this? You all are real Muslims. You're supposed to be with the Nation of Islam. No. We had to give dawah and teach people what real Islam was. We were the first mosque to really establish 5 salats a day in the city of Cleveland. Okay? And from that mosque, many young brothers and sisters went on and excelled in Islamic studies and Islamic academics. Sheikh Isam Bagby was part of that community. And we grew up together, and we became Muslim around the same time. It's a very vibrant community.
Mashallah, you bring up a good point. I mean, I think a lot of times, as a kind of a modernist philosophical tendency, we tend to reduce Islam to just the fiqh, the like legal aspects.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, yes, it's true. A person lives in America. It's completely lawful for them to wear pants and a shirt as long as their nakedness is covered and this, that, and the other thing, you know. But Islam is so much more than just the law. In our last podcast, we talked about one of the problems that hurts me the most is the aspirations of certain segments of our Muslim community, which is what? Is that they see in the oppressor themselves. They look, instead of looking at the Banu Israel and Musa alayhi salam, they look at Fir'aun and say, we see ourselves in them. We want to be part of that. We want to be like them. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things I appreciated, especially from our African American elders in this country, from that era, that they were the ones growing up spoon-fed, blonde hair, blue-eyed, fake man god, and they're like, no, we don't want our slave name. We don't want to dress like the dress that we were given. We don't want to worship them as God. We're done with this, you know. And I think it's really beautiful what you were saying, that unfortunately there are many people in our Muslim community of all colors and all backgrounds, and the outward form of the people may be different, but the sickness is the same inside the heart, that they see the archetype of the oppressor. And they say, if I just hustle a little bit, if I get enough grades, if I can get enough money, if I can move into the right neighborhood, I can be one of them. And like the teachings of Nubuwah, I mean, I'm not saying those people are not Muslims or even questioning their sincerity. Oftentimes these are very deep-seated psychological conditions that people have. But if you look at the pure teachings of Nabuwa, hell no, we don't want to be part of them. We want to have 1,000 miles between us and them in this world, and like 10 times that much on the day of judgment. We're not part of them. If somebody wants to, take this path with us, then welcome, because this one is leading to a good place and that one isn't. So I thought that was, something really beautiful you mentioned. Maybe inshallah, like later on when we hear from your son, for your grandson, inshallah, we can talk about why does it seem like in all of the Muslim communities, including wallahu alam, as an observer, even in the African American community, this spirit seems to have kind of weakened or dimmed or dulled down. Like, why is that?
Good point. Yes.
So again, as I was saying, right, that like when I see yourself, you might not know this, but I mashallah, tabarakallah, I admire you a lot, and a lot of the elders in our community who came into the deen, because I'm looking ahead 50 years from now, 40 years from now, I'm 20 years from now, right, of what my kids will be like and what my grandkids will be like. So we have a very different mentality because we came into the deen. So we have different expectations. So I became Muslim when I was 19. I had very similar experiences from what you're speaking about. Not exactly the same, but there are some parallels. And then now I have my kids who are being born and raised in Islam. And I'm hoping and praying like they see the beauty of it in the same way that we were able to see the beauty of it and embrace it. So we could deal with things maybe that aren't a part of Islam, even from the Muslim community, and it's not going to bother us because that's not where we came in. But people who maybe are born and raised as a Muslim and are being told like what Islam is supposed to be like, if they're not seeing it, and if there's some inconsistency with what they're being told and what they're witnessing in the community, that might be a problem, because they didn't necessarily choose it, but they're being taught what it's supposed to be. So then that kind of leads me to be quite interested in like Asim's perspective,
Absolutely.
Karim's perspective, being now born and raised as a Muslim, where maybe it started off predominantly where it's a majority African American community, but now you got the immigrant community coming in, and then there's a lot more interaction between different, and you thinking we're Muslim, and it doesn't matter where you're from. But was that reciprocated? I mean, I'm just interested to know.
That's a tough one. Not this whole conversation, obviously, is very tough. But growing up in the Masjid Al-Mukmin, it was special. The brothers that I grew up with, to this day, even if I don't see them, I could see them and I could call them for anything. And I haven't seen them in years. I could do it, and they could do the same with me. And that's the Muslim brotherhood that we were taught by these elders that we're speaking of. But we were also in Cleveland. And Cleveland is separated by a river. This river is the east side and the west side. And on the east side, you've got a lower, quote-unquote, socioeconomic state. Then on the west side, lower socioeconomic state, the whites and the blacks, for the most part. We're not talking suburbs, we're talking Cleveland proper, right? So in our own bubble, as an African-American masjid, to grow up that way was special. And then as we grow, and you mentioned growing up as a Muslim and being taught it as opposed to choosing it, right? As you grow, you begin to, as any teen does, question, am I being taught what I ultimately want to think, and all those sorts of things. And it's easier to leave it when you don't choose it, right? But when you're around so many people that were taught the same way, and what we know is the right way. We were taught Sunni Islam. We weren't taught any other offshoot of this and that, or 5% this, and we were taught true Islam the best way that they knew how to teach it to us. And then from there we were able to say, look, there is no other way. Whenever you don't choose Islam and you go out and research and you do your own research, if you come back to it and say there's another way, you're lying to yourself. because there's an answer for every question in Islam. There's an answer to the problems of racism in this country. There's an answer to the problems of racism in the Muslim community. It's all in Islam. So growing up, I'm very analytical. I get that from my mother, where I have to, for me, it's got to make sense for me, and it takes me a while. And you mentioned the pros and cons for the paper. I'm the same kind of way. I need to have it here and look at it, and then there's opinion there. I remember doing that when I was 14, 15, 16 years old about Islam, and did I want to be a Muslim? You know, and then I thought about it and do my own things and realized that my mother and father and the community in which they raised us in, that was my blessing, right? It was my blessing to be raised in such a vibrant African-American Muslim community, right? And all I try to do now is give my children this same blessing through the grace and mercy of Allah, inshallah. So it's funny because I've heard some of these stories from my father, but I remember back when I was 15, 16, 17, I asked him, why did you become Muslim? What was it about it? This was me in my own questioning period in your life when you go through. What made you become Muslim? Why did you do it? What were you thinking? And I've heard these stories, and I haven't heard them in years, and you hear it again, and it brings it back to me. Like, that's why, right? For me, I never grew up being faced with choosing the Trinity. To me, there has always been one God. There's always been La ilaha illallah, right? So my questions about Islam weren't about that. They were about, why are we somewhere where there aren't as many Muslims? If it's this real, if this is it, why isn't everybody a Muslim, right? And then you begin to realize, you start talking about the problems of America and how it was built on this, and it becomes a question of how can we make America better with Islam. So that's interesting.
So then when you were being raised, alhamdulillah, you had a vibrant African American community. Now as you got older, the community started getting a little more colorful, right? A little more diverse. The immigrant community started coming in. Other masajid were being built. What was your interaction with Muslims that weren't African American?
It is interesting. It existed. I remember doing some thinking about this a while back, and this is going to sound harsh, but a lot of immigrant Muslims because I'm 46, so we're talking 80s, 90s, right? So a lot of these Muslims come to America coattailing on the struggles that the African Americans laid out. But when they come over, they may identify as white. So then they come to America and assimilate with the white community as, I hate to say this, but as a closet Muslim, right? So they walk down the street looking, sounding, acting like a white man. So they reap the benefits of the socioeconomic status of a white man or a white woman. So they've essentially, for a time, I won't say forgotten, but ignored those who laid the path for them to come and choose Islam, choose a place where they can worship their Islam the right way. Because a lot of immigrants come from places where you can't worship Islam the right way. Right? You know what I mean? So they come here, America, for all of its problems, and we know what they are. You can come here and worship Islam. And you won't have to deal with a tyrannical this, tyrannical that. You can come here and you can worship your Islam. But when a lot of immigrants now came here, the road that was laid by the pioneers in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 30s was ignored. The masjids that were started were not supported. New masjids popped up where the immigrants would separate themselves from the African American community. So I don't know that there was genuine, I wouldn't say animosity, but there was tension between the African American community and the immigrant communities, right? And I remember when I was mid-teens, late teens, early 20s, we started having community Eid prayers at parks and things like that. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful. And you begin to see, you get to meet different people of different faiths. And I remember I studied, not different faiths, but different ethnicities. And I remember I studied Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. I read that book cover to cover like 5 times. And I remember when he made Hajj and he encountered white Muslims or Muslims of a different color than he, and they were his brothers. We didn't feel that here. It was different here because America was built on this idea that if you are a person of color, you were expected to accept your station as somewhat inferior. Now, I was raised never to do that, but it was almost expected that you had to, if you weren't going to do that, you had to fight a little more. So it was very interesting, and I think only until I'd say the late 80s, early 90s, maybe, it became, maybe my late 80s, early 90s, it became more where it felt more comfortable around a Muslim immigrant community.
I want to this is good, and I want to interject also because I know we have a diverse audience of listeners, right? It's beautiful how we heard from Bhai Abdul Samad about his accepting of Islam and the road to it, and in it there's the echo of even the stories of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, the pure and undiluted intellect of a child, who sees the irrationality of kufr and leaves it with sincerity, and how the help of Allah came down. And this is every nation of the earth that entered into Islam, including Quraysh itself. Sayyidina Ali accepted Islam as a child and stood in front of the elders of Banu Hashim and said La ilaha illallah when none of them would. It's reminiscent of all of that. Now that, mashallah, you have mentioned this part of your story, there are going to be people who are starting to feel uncomfortable. And the point of this podcast and this conversation is what? Remember, we're all coming from the same place and we're coming to the same table. And the point of raising this is not in order to start to put lighter fluid on a situation and light it on fire so that me and Sheikh Musa can build our, Tristan can build his podcaster empire. There are people like that, by the way, unfortunately, in our
that
community
is not
as
my
well.
intent.
And that's not your intent either. No, that's what I'm saying. That's why we're talking to you, We're not like, some guy with a bow tie and say, I don't want to put out the fire, I want to watch it burn. No, the whole point of Islam is that nothing should burn, inshallah. That's the hum of the Prophet ﷺ, that nothing should burn. Even his enemies shouldn't burn, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But people are going to start feeling uncomfortable now because they're like, well, we came from suffering too. Suffering, like we like to remind everybody, it's not Olympics, that the gold medal winner, and if you're not on the podium, you go home a loser or whatever. These are brothers, mashallah, they sympathize with the plight of our brothers and sisters who came from other countries where they're oppressed. Can we also then see our Islam and theirs as immigrants and sympathize with their plight as well? Like a classroom, like kindergarten classroom, 30 kids, 29 of them had breakfast, one of them didn't. He's hungry. Everybody thinks that everyone's full, but they don't know the hunger of that brother. Listen to them and see what is it that they're feeling so that we can rectify it, because the problems we face as an ummah are big. We're not going to be able to face them down if we're broken and divided. And if we do lip service unity, it means nothing if we're not united in the hearts. And for that, we have to sit and uncomfortably listen and hear these stories.
May I just add one point? When the immigration of Muslims from Arabia, the Middle East, Asia happened back in the middle 60s, 70s, most of the immigrants that came here came from colonized countries. They were colonized by Europeans. And the fact is that those who were colonized were given certain impressions about us as African Americans. So you have colonized immigrants coming to America who have been given a certain picture by the colonizers about us before they even get here.
Right.
So when they get off the boat, when they get off the plane, and they see us here, who has been here for 400 years, struggling under the boot of a white America. And then they run to white America and turn their backs on us. And we're both Muslim. This is what we taste. We keep it under control, but it's there.
Right.
And we saw it, we experienced it, and it's a silent disease that was brought here by the colonized Muslims that immigrated here to America. And it's not like they weren't approached, because we say, oh, Muslims, alhamdulillah, assalamu alaikum. That's not how you say assalamu alaikum. Can you read Quran? Do you have a job? I literally had people asking me if I had a job. Wallahi. The impression that many of them have was that we were lazy, that we were gangsters, that we were thugs and fornicators.
And this gets back to
And that's how they look at
the
us.
picture of America and the racialization of America for 450 years or more, where you take how you can take people and dehumanize them and make them chattel and make them slaves. The only way to do that is to dehumanize them. And for 450 years, that is still there. It's still there in some people's minds, whether they want to believe it or act upon it or not, right? So, like he says, when I think about other places that the Europeans have gone and colonized, they've influenced those places, but when they with Africa, they didn't influence them. They just took people. They took them and brought them here, and a lot of those people were Muslim. They were Muslim. Mm-hmm. And so we were here as Muslims before anyone.
Right at the start.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Africans were here as Muslims before anyone. And there are stories, and I just started getting into this recently, of stories of Muslims that were slaves practicing in secret. And over the past 3-4 years, we started reading about this stuff, and it's amazing.
Well, everybody's seen this. Many people
mm-hmm.
saw the story Roots.
Yep, Roots. Mm-hmm.
You know, and they were Muslim. You know, and so, you know, the thing is that Islam is not new to us.
No.
Okay. It was taken from us.
Right.
By the way, you mentioned roots. When I was studying in Mauritania, there was one of our classmates, Sheikh Kimo, Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him. He passed away. One of the most beautiful people I knew. You never met him. We met him in Mauritania, you know. Inshallah, maybe if we have a chance, we can talk about him. Allah have mercy on him. Whoever hears this, inshallah, read the Fatiha for him. A beautiful brother. He was Mandinka ethnically, and he was from the village of Kunta Kinte. And he said so many Americans used to come and visit the village. And he said, as a child, the only explanation I could think of in my head was that Kunta Kinte must have been a great alim. He must have been a great sheikh who had knowledge of the deen. This is the only reason, like anyone, why would people come from so far to visit his village, you know? But like, you know, some of these things are very full circle, mashallah. Yeah.
So it's very comforting to see now where Islam is and where it's going to go, inshallah, in America, because growing up it was different. It was interesting to see the separation of the masjids, and then you start getting into the questions of who has the right Eid here and there, and all the community Eids that we used to have kind of fell away. But for a time we would have them, everybody in the city would come to one place, and that's when you began to see I began to have friends that were from different places around the world, and some of my lifelong friends still to this day that I got to meet, and it's from those community aids that we used to have, and of course they've begun to fall away.
Sheikh Musa, mashallah, Sheikh Musa, Allah Ta'ala, for whatever reason, in his hikmah, he gave the riyasa of this ilm to us. Inshallah, we commit, inshallah, that from our sides, and we invite we join the other imams that are committed to it also, that inshallah, if we can do that, if we can all get together and have a great gathering for Eid, maybe Corona may not allow it for this Eid al-Adha, but in the future, according to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and the teaching of the Book of Allah Ta'ala, if we can do that again, we can unite all the different people, under one cover. We cast our turban into that inshallah vision.
That was a beautiful time in Islam in Cleveland, because prior to that, coming together collectively for Eid, there was this chasm between the immigrant Muslims and the African American community that was very, very bitter. And when we would visit the immigrant masjids, we weren't made to feel welcome. Okay, we would. People wouldn't even approach us. After giving salams, they would kind of break off into their own little huddles and speak their own languages, and we were like standing there, and we got all 3 different languages, and people are ignoring us, and we're supposed to sit there in these conversations, which to me is an insult. Okay, when everybody speaks one common language, and you sit around a table with Muslims to break bread, to share tea, and then the only one that can't understand it is the African American Muslim.
Which, by the way, is haram. The Prophet ﷺ forbade that if there's a group of people and one of them doesn't you have a conversation that is secret, that you exclude one of them from that conversation. He forbade people from doing that. And the fuqaha comment that the way that's described in the hadith is if you huddle off to the side. But included in the ruling of that is speaking a language that person doesn't speak.
And so many times when this would happen, I can just recall, and many African American Muslims say that they just get up and leave. Right. I'm not sitting here. I'm not going to be insulted like this. I'm out of here.
There's any black person in this country knows what it feels like to be made to feel unwelcome. You can walk into a room, you see the look, and you know it.
Yeah.
It's just what it is. You can walk into a room, you see it, and it's not just black people, it's people of any ethnicity that's not white. Okay? You walk into a room, you see it, and it's like, okay, it's one of those kind of vibes.
Right.
And then you just know what you got to deal with, you embrace it, you deal with it, and you move on. But to be made to feel that way in an Islamic community, it's like we're going to go back to our masjid, we're going to do it, we're going to grow our community, right, the best way we can. And when they're ready to do as we want to do, then we'll try again.
So on that note, this reminds me of a conversation that we had once before at a mutual friend's home, in which you shared some information with me that I had not ever heard before, which was the story of how the Islamic Center of Cleveland, the conversation of where it was intended to be and how it came to be. I was really hoping that you'd be willing to share from your perspective and your background, share with us a little bit of that information, inshallah.
Okay, well, my knowledge of that, the Islamic Center history is kind of like, it's known and it's unknown. Most people today don't know really the origins of how the Islamic Center started. But prior to it being in the location where it is, it was where Masjid Rasulullah is.
Yes.
Okay? And obviously it outgrew itself. So there was a discussion at that point that they wanted to expand. And there was a discussion, well, maybe we should bring it closer to a central area where Muslims from the east side and west side of the river can, collectively come together.
Was there a group of people who were discussing this?
There was a group of people, to my understanding, that were of that camp, where we need to bring it closer. Okay? And my understanding is that they began butting heads. Well, no, we don't want to move it too close to, to the east side because, obviously the feeling was that the African Americans would overpopulate or integrate into the new masjid, and, obviously we weren't welcome. Okay? And then there was the other group that said, well, we should try to bring the Muslims together. Long story short, it ended up in Parma. Now, anybody that knows the history of Parma in Cleveland knows that Parma has been the hotbed of racism for the African American community for over 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
And when that mosque was built in Parma, that sent a message to the African American community, because they knew without a doubt that Parma was racist. As a matter of fact, Parma could not even receive federal money because of their racist policies.
Right.
Again, like people will feel like threatened or like hurt or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
This is Abdul Samad is he's a person who wills good to Islam and to the Muslims. That much is not clear by like the podcast at this point. I don't know what will clear your head to it. So when he says it, we should take heed of it. I myself am the imam in the masjid in Parma.
Mm-hmm.
I walk to the masjid oftentimes. I don't feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
People will let their dogs out and things like that. Like I don't, I feel it. I feel that vibe, and I'm not, I don't present like I'm white, but I don't, and I don't present like I'm black either. But even I myself feel what you're saying. And there's been a lot of, change since that, from that time to now. And I'm not saying we have to burn the masjid down. And I'm not saying that like everyone's horrible. And there are many people in the masjid, if you ask them, they'll be like, yeah, mashallah, alhamdulillah, the parking is really good over here. And like, it's better than the parking in Rasulullah, which is probably true. But, and that's fine. We're not saying you're a racist person because you like that masjid. Just try to understand what other people feel, that they don't feel the same thing that you feel. Try to understand, like, where they're coming from, sympathize with it, in order for us to, like, heal the rifts, whether we want to acknowledge they exist or not. They exist. And we're not going to be able to move forward until we heal them.
If white people say that Parma is racist, what do you think black people feel?
Right.
So we had to we had to swallow that. That unspoken message from a Muslim community when they built that mosque in Parma. And we was like, whoa.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
And
we understand.
What's interesting
and
about
so
this,
we peeled back, man, because we knew what that meant. We felt it.
What's interesting about this is, as a person who, so my position is a little bit different. I made my shahada when I was older than both of you brothers. Kind of coming to that point where I was asking myself questions about Islam. I was already 25, and my father moved our family over to the west side because he worked at Ford. And so I grew up on the west side, one of those pocket communities of African Americans on the west side. There are several of them.
That community.
And so when I got older and I started to kind of question myself regarding faith and start to look into different things, the only mosque that I had any recollection of was the Islamic Center in Cleveland, because we've driven past it many times. My mother used to work at Sears, that was in Middleburg Heights, like right there on 130th. So we drove past it a lot of times. And so when it came to a point where I needed to know something about Islam, all I could think was, oh yeah, there's that big building with the gold dome. That's a mosque, I think. And so when I went to that masjid, immediately black people on the west side know the same thing. Parma is not an area you want to hang out in. It's not a place that you go. It's not a place it's just, you're not welcome there.
Driving while black.
Right. And so when I went there, I was on guard. I was just like, I'm in unfamiliar territory or unwelcoming territory, but I have questions that I need answered. And so when I went there, and I started going there regularly, not unsurprisingly, no black people at all. I was the only black person, I think, that went to that mosque for a really long time, until I would see other people, and it was usually people that were like passing by. They were truck drivers that said, hey, I just needed to go to a mosque so I could pray or something, and so it was very rare for me to see another black person. And then when I started to explore the city of Cleveland and really start to want to learn more about Islam, I went to the east side and I started going to the other masajid. And then what wound up happening at that point is a lot of people kind of questioned me, like, why do you go to that masjid? Why do you go to that mosque? You know, it was almost like, you know, my black card was in question, right? And you know, I just straight up told, it's like, I grew up on the West Side. And
Right.
that
I
was the
remember having
closest
that
mosque.
conversation with
Yeah,
you.
yeah. Many people have had that, and a lot of people. Some people don't even have the conversation. They just look at me a certain type of way, like, yeah, you be over there, you know. And so, you know, alhamdulillah, there are some people who are a little bit more understanding, and you know, they do want to know more. But there's a certain attitude that I have received, even from my brothers and sisters in the African American community, because it's just a question mark, like, why? Because it was across the board understood, like, we aren't welcome there. And so over the years, when I started to become more familiar with the Muslim community on the East Side, and we started to develop relationships with, you know, the elders in our community, and subhanAllah, you know, making my shahada was like a big moment in my life, right? But getting in touch with the African American community years after that, it was like another mind-blowing experience, because when I remember clearly when I first went to First Cleveland Masjid, it was like I say it all the time to brothers that I talk to, I felt like I had just came home. Even though I was a stranger in that community, I felt more at home there the very first time I went than I did at ICC for years. And so that, listening to your story is very interesting for me, because, you know, you have 3 generations of Muslims, as Sheikh Musa has opened up and talked about. And so personally, I'm very curious to continue to hear more from all of you. I'm especially curious to hear some of your feelings in regards to the Muslim community, and how you have interacted with the younger generation, because talking about ICC, I think the younger generation at that masjid, as well as the other masjid, this may not be a realistic thing for them. They don't know this history. And so, yeah, I'd just like to hear from you.
Yeah, awesome. We're not going to let you off the hook, man. You weren't going to get away. I was trying to steer it towards you, you know. This is awesome. This is the grandson of Sheikh Muhammad and the nephew of Karim. He's the son of your daughter and his sister, Medina. So Allah Ta'ala bless you. He'll be going off to school at the University of Miami, Ohio. Inshallah, it's coming fall. Sisters who are watching the YouTube video, make sure you lower your gaze, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, he still gotta do his studies, inshallah.
So I've been going to Masjid Mu'min my whole life, because that's where my father grew up in that community. He raised around those brothers, and they helped him convert to Islam. So that's sort of the community that I've grown up in, and had Imam Mutawaf as my imam, and he's almost like another grandfather to me. Just the amount of stories he's had. You know, I remember a lot of times, like every time after Juma, me and a bunch of the other younger brothers would just go up to his office and sit and just listen to the stories he would tell us with a lot of the other older brothers, and just listen. And so a lot of these stories that Abi is saying, you know, I've heard some of them I haven't heard, but I've been able to piece sort of things together. But growing up in that community, you know, it's like pretty much like 99% African American Muslims, which is sort of comforting for me to just see all these other African American Muslims. It sort of helped me growing up a Muslim. And some of the closest that I've felt to Islam was during my times at Itikaf, when I went up to the mosque for Itikaf. I went 3 years ago, and then 2 years ago. Obviously this year we couldn't, but ever since 3 years ago, I'd been going up for Itikaf, and just sitting around all those brothers who have been so impactful for Islam in Cleveland, and just hearing their stories. It was just like awe. Like I was in awe of hearing all these stories of how important they really were for this community. But one thing I remember, we were talking about how they used to have community Eids, or how the community used to be so vibrant and together. And my father would always tell me stories about how the people of his generation, they would take them up to New York, to Philadelphia, to different Muslim communities around America, just learning with these other communities, getting to know other brothers, you know, connecting the Muslims of America. And obviously now we don't have that anymore. And it's kind of sad that we don't have that, but because of this rift that Abi and Uncle Karim were talking about, obviously I wasn't a part of that, but hearing those stories and understanding why that rift was created. But I think now we're in a time more than ever where it's important that we unite. And I think our mosque, we're sort of Masjid Mu'min, we're sort of in the like passing of the torch phase from the older generation to my father's generation in the 40s and 50s, sort of passing the leadership. And I think now would be the perfect time to, address the rifts and address these uncomfortable conversations and move forward from there. I think it's important to still address what happened, and there's a sort of disrespect that was shown to the African American community. But I think if we can, as long as those can be addressed and they're not ignored, and we can build from there, I think that would be important, because I've always wanted to have a big community Eid, because I know some people from different communities and different masjids, but we always have our separate Eids, our separate Eid feasts, and I've always wondered why we can't have just one large one where everyone is there, and you drive past a park and you just see hundreds and hundreds of Muslims just around a tent or whatever that may be. I've always thought that might be nice, but
so Asim, what has been the extent of your engagement and interaction with, because you're in a community which is predominantly African American Muslims, right? So what was the extent of your engagement with Muslims who are not African American, whether they're Arabi, Palestinian, Syrian, Indian, Pakistani?
It hasn't been much, except for first grade I went to Al Hassan, so that was like, during that time it was like mostly Arab teachers and just like a few African Americans. And I remember, I don't remember exactly all that of my time there, but I do remember some. I didn't really feel welcome at that school. Like they would I was in the first grade, but they would throw me to the second grade and say, oh, go to this classroom, or oh, go to this classroom for this class. And it was just like, well, why am I bouncing around? Why am I not staying with my classmates? I think at that time I was the only African American in my homeroom, and they would just put me in the classroom with two other African Americans who might have been, I think they were some of the only ones there. And I was always sent to the principal's office for the smallest things. It just I just didn't really feel welcome. And so that was in first grade. That was my first interaction with non-African American Muslims. But ever since then, I haven't really had much interaction, because I go to a mainly African American mosque, so I don't know any other non-African American Muslims that are my age. I know some, but I don't really have a connection with them. And I think some of the stories that Abi and Uncle Karim are telling it's the result of some of these stories that they're telling of how these rifts are created, or how we were made unwelcome. And that's why I don't have any non-African American Muslim friends, is because of some of these stories that they're telling. And that's
I will say this too. I supervise open gym at ICC twice a week, and that's where I know Asim from. And when I first started going there, this is now about 8 years, been in community 9 years. Shortly after that, started doing that. It was predominantly Arabi that were coming to play. And since then, it's been a lot more diverse. I'm not saying that's because of me, this is what I've observed. And I do try to make sure that everyone is treated the same and everyone has their same access to the court. So we have the African Americans from the east side who are coming. We got the Somalis from Masjid Rasulullah who come regularly. And it's pretty diverse, mashallah. There's been 3 times I've had to break up a fight because brothers put hands on each other in those years. And all 3 times it was Arabi and African American. And I see it firsthand, the tension that exists. And a part of it, there could be a number of reasons why. It could be because of the lack of integration that exists. It could be because of the experiences that some of the kids, and again, just to be quite frank, that even some of the Arabic-speaking kids have, who have parents that have maybe liquor stores in black communities. So their experiences with the black community are very limited to their experiences with their shops. And then they project that on all African Americans, even their brothers. And I, again, this is something that I've witnessed firsthand in this interaction of youth. This is now 3rd generation, where you would hope that it wasn't so prevalent anymore. But I've seen the whole referring to, they're always like that. I've heard those words. Yes. These brothers are always like that. What do you mean with these brothers? right? And the only 3 times I've had to break up a fight because of people putting hands was African American and Arabic, and Arab brothers. So we do have to somehow like acknowledge that.
And yeah, our Arab and whatever immigrant
I'm
brothers.
not saying, Sheikh, right,
Yeah.
that it's the fault of the Arab brothers
No,
or
and
the
that's-
African American
and that's
brothers.
what I'm saying.
I'm saying that's what it is.
Our
Right.
Arab and immigrant brothers, they're gonna be like, well, I don't own a liquor store, and I don't say that to my kids, and I don't, or like I never heard that from my. I know, majority of people are not gonna be like that. But what we're asking you is not to like self-flagellate for someone else's sins. What we're just asking is like, can you just at least keep it in your heart that there's maybe some of your African American brothers have gone through these experiences from somebody else who was unscrupulous, and can you acknowledge that it happened and try to maybe reach out and make it clear that you are welcome and we don't look at you that way in order to reverse, because that's always what happens. There's a certain set of people who cause mischief and they break things, and they're the ones that we ask Allah to have mercy on them, because there's not really much good that's going to come from them. And then there are the blessed people who are the most beloved to Allah, who are the ones who take somebody else's mess and they clean it up, and take someone else's thing that's broken and they fix it. And Allah, as a result, A, gives them the greatest share of His love, and B, then all the reward of of being fixed for everybody, it all gathers up, and then it's the crown that sits on their head. That can you just like hear these experiences and be like, look, we want to be the ones who fix, even though we're not the ones who caused the mess. And if you are causing the mess and you want to fix it, that's nurun ala nur.
If I could just address the whole issue of the stores that are owned by Muslims in the African American community who openly sell liquor, pork, alcohol, gambling, lottery tickets, in some places pornography under the table in the black community. And I go into these stores and they have Quran, Arabic all over signs. You hear the adhan going off in the stores, on their phones. And it makes you want to throw up. And the way that they look at the people in the community is even worse. And Sheikh Musa kind of, touched on it a little bit. Because when you're selling alcohol to African Americans and they come in drunk and they come in under the influence of drugs, people may get the perception that, quote unquote, all of African Americans are like this. And so they take these stories home. And when you hear them say words like abid,
I told you that story.
okay, behind the counter, abid is the N word, and everybody knows it. And when you hear them say abid in these stores and they think nobody knows what they're talking about, if those clients in that store knew what they were calling them, they would get treated the same way a white person would get treated by calling that person an N-word.
Right.
Because that's where it comes from.
I have a story.
And so, one other point, this whole issue of racial prejudice that's caused by the colonists, that's caused by white America, has put this wedge between us as Muslims. I grew up, as you know, through an African American community, okay? Being involved in a lot of African American focused issues as far as Islam is concerned. But that's not Islam. That's not Islam. For us to have an African American Muslims silo over here, and an Arab silo over here, and a Pakistani silo over here. And when I made Hajj, I had an epiphany at that point. So I'm getting ready to go back to America. I'm getting ready to go back to an African American mosque where it's just African American people, where I break bread with African American Muslims. This ain't right. I'm just leaving Hajj with all these different rainbows, and I'm seeing the beauty of Islam. And I had to make a choice, a tough choice, where I had to decide if I was going to continue to spend out the last whatever years of my life in a segregated community, or to try to reach out and to find a mosque that at least had some semblance of diversity. And it was a tough choice for me. It was a tough choice, but I know in my heart that that's what Islam is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be bitter African American Muslims huddled together because the Arabs don't like them. It's not supposed to be an African American masjid, okay, that feels comfortable because they don't like us over there. We need to find that sweet spot in the Muslim community. And so I had to really think about it, and I decided that I was just going to test the waters and find a community that wasn't 100% African American. And I decided, and this isn't a plug for any particular community, okay?
Please go ahead, plug away.
Okay, but I'm a member of MACE.
Yeah, I'll put the plug for you. Sheikh Muhammad has been a board member, a trustee at MACE for a number of years now, and whatever involvement I've had a lot to do with his involvement as well.
What is MACE for our
MACE is the
Ohio
Muslim
challenged viewers?
Muslim Association of Cleveland East, and we have there is a pretty diverse group of leadership there. Mani at some point was also there, so alhamdulillah.
Yes. And so I just started to attend MACE. It was even before the new mosque was built, when it was a small building. And I never once felt the type of uncomfortableness that I felt when I would go to other mosques that weren't African American.
MashaAllah.
Not to say that it's perfect, but at least it didn't hit me in the face. Okay? So I decided that I was going to give it a try, and this was almost 8 years ago. And I began to do things, and I was nominated by members of MACE to be part of the board, and the board voted me to be the chairman of the board, which I was for 3 years, the board of trustees. And now my term expired, and I'm just on the board right now. But I say that because despite all that, it's still not perfect. Nothing is perfect. This is the dunya, you know? So if we're looking for a utopia, we ain't gonna find it here.
Facts.
Okay? And that's what I keep in my mind all the time. There's no utopia on this earth. Okay? And it's that way for a reason, because people that are sitting in this circle, people that are watching this podcast, they need to understand that it's not going to change because we make dua. It's not going to change because we stay in our own particular, communities. We have to actively do the work. It's not going to come down from the sky. People are going to actually have to do the work and struggle to make this thing happen, where Muslims can be together as one.
I mean, this is Sheikh Amin, the patron of Dar al-Qasim, at which, mashallah, Sheikh Musa teaches currently, and I've also taught in the past and looked to for a lot of guidance in matters of ilm. He's very fond of mentioning this, that in Hajj, one of the important parts of Hajj, it's a rukn for everyone but the Hanafis, I get that, is the sa'i, going back and forth between Safa and Marwa. And sa'i means to strive, and it was a Mubarak act that Hajar, the mother of Sayyidina Ismail, ran back and forth looking for the water, and Allah loved it so much that every believer has to do this for their Hajj and Umrah to be complete until the Day of Judgment. And he's very fond of mentioning this, that running back and forth between the two mountains doesn't create water. Allah gave the water with, in a completely miraculous way that was disconnected to any effort, but He still want to see you hustle. He doesn't want to see you sit down and wait for it to come to you, even if all it is you do something, even though you know that it's not gonna come with any result. Literally, the word sa'i, if we were to have like modern urban translation, hustle. You got to hustle. You
Right.
got to hustle to make it happen. You put your net in the water, the net doesn't create the fish, but if your net ain't in the water, don't blame Allah Ta'ala if you didn't catch nothing. Like mashallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward our Mubarak elders, mashallah, and all of those who are hustling, whether they're known, whether the podcast mentions you or it doesn't mention you, Allah knows who you are. And those are the people who, because of them, Allah's mercy and barakah comes down on the entire Jamaat, mashallah.
We definitely appreciate the time of the family, and this seems like it's gonna have to continue to like a part 2. And mashallah, alhamdulillah, and there's enough of the family I think that might be able to be involved to have a part 2 as well, inshallah. I don't think we're lacking in participants. So perhaps we can get back to this in the near future, and we're grateful for your time. I wanted to hear more out of Asim, and we're working towards that, but maybe we'll give each of you a last word if you all don't mind, inshallah.
Well, I guess I'll just reiterate from what I said before, how as I've grown up in the same mainly African American community, I've always wondered what it would be like if we were all united, in one community or one big Eid, or every 3 months have one big Cleveland Muslim community iftar or dinner. And obviously, like Abi said, there's nothing's gonna be perfect. There's always going to be differences. There's always going to be, people who don't like each other. But if we can come together as a mass, ignore the sort of smaller, side beefs or whatever you want to call them, and move past, the days of old, and move forward, with new leadership, new ideas, and sort of use those and come together as one. I think that could also, bring about change in America, in the Muslim communities of America. Cleveland was once one of the was in the forefront of the Muslim community in America. We can do that once again in uniting the Muslims of America, and it could start with Cleveland. We just have to, have these conversations, make it aware of the past, but also, move forward with new leadership, and hopefully that could create something special in the future.
I mean,
Karim, and then we'll let your father have a final word.
I guess the only thing I have left to say for now, because I definitely want to be a part of part 2, because there's a lot more that needs to be said, but in any organization, like if you're talking about masjids, it's always going to be a microcosm of the society in which it resides, right? So whatever, we're in America, it's got its own inherent problems that were built upon what we all know. It was built upon slavery, and the dichotomy of liberty versus slavery is all built upon that. So if you have a community of Muslims that is inside of that, it's going to take on its root, its flavor, its essence, right? But we have the answer. we have Islam, right? So if we can do what we need to do inside of our own communities, we can influence America, because there is no other answer. The answer is Islam, and that's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of Islam, is that it's the answer for everything. So we can root out everything that America was built on and encapsulate this country in Islam. It can happen, and inshallah it will.
Yes, I'd just like to end with this comment that there's things called conscious and unconscious discrimination. And no one owns that. No race owns that. No particular nationality owns that. And until we recognize as a ummah that there are conscious racism that exists within us and unconscious racism that exists within us, we're not gonna make any progress. Okay, because all of us have our own unconscious and conscious discrimination. But what we need to do is that we need to work together despite that, and recognize that. And that's what the Prophet, peace be upon him, said in his last sermon. Okay, for someone to look at me and say, I don't see you as a black person, I automatically think that they're racist. Because that's not what Allah said. Allah said He created us what? In different colors that we would know each other. So don't look at me and say, when I look at you, brother, I don't see you as a black Muslim, a black American. I just see you as Muslim. Okay? So we need to understand that we need to accept, the rainbow of color that we have as Muslims, and we need to accept the good that we have to add, that we have to add to this community, and we need to build upon that. And that the problem is in the leadership in the Muslim community that exists. And as Asim said, sooner or later the passing of the torch is going to happen to young men when he's 30 years old, when he's 25 years old. His generation. What are they learning from us? Where will Islam be when he's at the point in a community where he may have to take on a position of the board? What signals are they getting from us, the elders? And I would like to finally say that these type of things that Sheikh Musa, Tristan, and the other brothers that are here, this podcast, I think is quite special. Because we're taking advantage of this medium in order to address, as the Sheikh said, some very difficult discussions. Okay, and you can only heal by breaking the scab. And there's a lot of scabs going around. So we got to pull that scab off. We got to let the fresh air get to it, and inshallah we'll all learn from it in the future. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
I just wanted to do some closing remarks. I just want to say thank you to the Cleveland Public Library as we are using the equipment from that institution to record this information. And inshallah in the future there will be some opportunities for us to do some work with the public library in Cleveland. So just wanted to kind of end on that note before we close with the dua, inshallah.
اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم أعنا على ذكرك وشكرك وحسن عبادتك. اللهم يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا على دينك. اللهم يا مصرف القلوب صرف قلوبنا على طاعتك. اللهم إنا نسألك أفعال الخيرات وترك المنكرات وحب المساكين، وأن تغفر لنا وترحمنا، وإذا أردت بعبادك فتنة فاقبضنا إليك غير مفتونين. اللهم إنا نسألك حبك وحب من يحبك وحب العمل يقربنا إلى حبك. اللهم اجعل حبك أحب إلينا من الماء البارد. اللهم رب اغفر وارحم وأنت خير الراحمين. Ya Allah, your fadl and your grace, your karam brought us on this Mubarak hour of this Mubarak day together. This is the Mubarak day of Friday, and these are the hours before the Mubarak day of Friday are going to close. Ya Allah, we seek the moment of your answering our prayers, that you should forgive us and forgive the ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that you should rectify our state and rectify the state of the ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in this world and the hereafter. Ya Allah, you're the one who gathered the best of every qawm and every tribe and every nation under La ilaha illallah, starting with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his Mubarak companions. خلاصة العرب الأرباع وخير الخلائق بعد الأنبياء عليهم الصلاة والسلام رضي الله عنهم, and the best of the Persians and the best of the Turks and the best of the Abyssinians and the best of all of the people in every direction, Ya Allah, black, white, or whatever color they may be, the best of the people who speak every one of the tongues that you graced your creation with, the best of the people from your creation, you gathered them under the flag of La ilaha illallah. Ya Allah, unite their hearts and end their disputes with one another. Ameen. Ya Allah, synchronize their hearts and end their disputes with one another, and make amongst them those who when they speak the people will listen, and when they command the people will obey, and when they prohibit the people will desist. Ya Allah, increase their numbers and strengthen them and quicken them in their minds and in their hearts and in their spirits, in their speech and in their actions. Ya Allah, increase their ranks and make us the first ones to serve them, and make us the first ones that are under their flag and in their camp, and make us the first ones who love them in our hearts, and the ones who support them in our deed and in our speech, and make us into them, Ya Allah, and protect us from ever being the ones who oppose them. And Ya Allah, whoever the mischief makers are from your creation, Give relief to the ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam from their mischief. Ya Allah, weaken them and confound their plots and schemes, and make their plots and schemes their own destruction between each other. Make them fight with one another, and give relief to your creation and relief to the ummah, Ya Allah. Ya Allah, and protect us from ever being the ones who love them or speak in their favor or serve them or do anything in their service or in their support, whether it's inward or outward, hidden or secret or public, Ya Allah, and protect us from ever being amongst them. Ya Allah, whatever the noble plans and the noble wishes and desires and intentions the Prophet ﷺ had for the betterment of this creation and this mankind, and for the betterment of this creation, Ya Allah, bless us and honor us by being the ones who are the ones in our tongues and in our limbs and in our hearts who carry this project forward, and keep it alive, Ya Allah, even despite the plots and the schemes of those people who don't know you or your Rasul ﷺ, and even if their plots and schemes were so magnificent and so great that they would make mountains rent asunder. Wa sallallahu tabaraka wa ta'ala wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Allahumma rabbana taqabbal minna واختم لنا بالحسنى ووفقنا لما تحب وترضى به وارفع بأيدينا راية الإسلام بركة الفاتحة.
Jazakallah khair. Appreciate it.